In addition to being able to make your own gradients and apply them to objects, you can select an object that already has a gradient applied to it and change it. So when we opened up this image for the first time, it already had this gradient applied to this kind of background base area of the violin. And so as soon as we select this object, you can see that under the fill option, we see that it's got this linear gradient applied to it. And incidentally, if you click this down pointing arrow, you are going to get a list of all the gradients that are applied inside this image. So here we have this gradient that we just applied to this little object, and this one is actually what's applied to the handle. So you can click any particular gradient, and you can then go in and start editing it. Now, the first thing I don't like about this gradient is the color. But what I also don't like is that it's set to start from this bright cyan and then move into complete transparency. And the effect we actually see is that it goes from cyan to this black color. That's just because the object behind it is filled with black. So if I select this object behind it, I could fill this with any other color, for example, something like this bright red. And now you see that it goes from cyan to sort of red. So this is actually just going into complete transparency. And the reason why I don't like that is because in this area where they don't overlap, you get this kind of strange gap, and it doesn't really look right. So I'm just going to undo that. And what I'm going to do now is select this object. We've got the correct gradient selected, and I'm going to go edit. And we have two stops. If we click the first stop, we see that the alpha setting is set right up to the highest. So this is fully opaque. However, the second stop is set right down to 0. So it's fading into complete transparency. So the first thing I want to do is just put this right up to the top. It's all the same color now, but at least we know what colors we're working with, and we don't get this weird little overlap problem here. And now I can select each stop and simply start modifying the colors. So if I go to my wheel, for example, I much prefer something like this deep red. So we've got this kind of red color. And I can then go to the second stop. And again, I can make this anything that I want. I could go for something like a kind of deep purple. Now I'm just kind of messing around with random colors here, but you get the idea. You can choose any colors that you want, you can apply them. You could go to something like gray. And there you have a new gradient. Simple as that. Just one other thing I wanted to alert you to is that when you have a particular gradient applied to more than one object, if you change that gradient, it's going to change the way that gradient works for all the objects that it's applied to. And just to give you a better idea, let's say that I wanted this background to look something like this little object over here. I could then choose that particular gradient, and we can see that this is now the same gradient. Even though I only have this background object selected and not this small object, if I now edit this gradient, for example changing the red stop to something like a purple, notice that it affects both the objects. So this gradient is being affected, and because it's applied to both objects, we see a change in both of them. And in this case, that's not what I want. I only want this purple to be applied to this background and not to this one. So I'm going to hit Ctrl-Z to undo. In that case, what you want to do is you want to first duplicate the gradient. So the gradient that we have applied to this small object is gradient 6413. If I now select this back object, we see that it's the same gradient that's applied. I can now duplicate this, and I now get gradient 6432. If I click on this small object, we see that it now has a separate gradient applied. So because they now have two different gradients applied, whatever changes I make to this 6432 gradient is not going to affect this object as well. And I can now change this to something like purple. And you can see that the changes are only going to affect the gradient that we've got applied to this background image.